Part 2 to George Orwell's 1984. Is it BBC's government-sponsored anti-government propaganda? Wise tyrants know that the best way to neutralize anti-government protests is to be the ones who start them, or at least to infiltrate them and guide them, sometimes with funding and training, sometimes just with inciting, information and disinformation, leaks, false or true, and so on. So for whatever reason, former employees of intelligence or spy agencies like the CIA or the KGB may be among the most celebrated leaders of anti-government conspiracy fanatics or anti-government conspiracy enthusiasts, whatever you might want to call it. A dramatic headline would be ex-CIA agent criticizes CIA. That always makes for, an appealing point of irony. So when in the 1930s, U.S. Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler presented his criticism of war, or at least of U.S. imperialism in Central America, that was called War is a Racket, and that was published first by Round Table Press, and then in condensed form by Reader's Digest, and it achieved a huge circulation. However, how many people notice Round Table as the name of the publisher and what that name implies? Who is the Round Table? What was the Round Table? And how is that related to, basically cartels and groups of elitists that gather in secret meetings and so forth. So what if the publication of that content, War is a Racket, intentionally produced a wave of anti-government sentiment, a wave of anti-war sentiment? If so, could the publishers have been producing anti-government sentiment, anti-U.S. sentiment, on behalf of the interests of the U.S. government? We might presume that anti-American sentiment would be cultivated by foreign enemies of the U.S., but again, George Orwell suggested that governments may cultivate sentiment against the very ones doing the cultivating. Governments may cultivate sentiment against their own government. Are governments inciting riots in order to justify firing on anti-government rebel fanatics? Is that the kind of thing that they would do to produce widespread public interest in a Patriot Act or a National Security Act or a Homeland Security thing? Would governments entice people to attack civilians? Would governments attack civilians within their own domestic populations? Obviously, when we're talking about, tanks rolling in Tiananmen Square and governments firing on their own civilians, well, obviously they do that sometimes. Or they fire on the indigenous peoples or the people who happen to already be there when they're colonizing a new colony. So several years ago, the creators of the U.S. TV show South Park had an episode parodying how having peace protests in the U.S. looks really good for international PR or for public opinion about the U.S. in other places. It's like saying something like this: yes, we are invading and occupying your country, but most of us here in the U.S. are sensitive and peace-loving Americans. So please don't get the wrong idea about us just because we're dropping bombs on civilians again. So I had never thought of how it could be that anti-war sentiment might be promoted by a government in order to produce a variety of outcomes that would be beneficial politically to that government, that source of propaganda. So when I read 1984, George Orwell's book, I had never before thought that governments might entice rebellion for their own purposes, such as to attract rebellion, to identify isolated rebels, and attract the rebels to throw themselves, armed only with big signs with anti-government slogans, to throw themselves at riot squads armed with things like tanks. So you got a big group of people with signs and slogans, and their flags are on fire. They're burning flags and stuff like that. And the other group has hoses, water cannons, and actual regular cannons on the turrets of tanks, and they have sniper squads and crowd dispersal grenades and tear gas and rubber bullets and metal bullets. That's a pretty big differential. So now I think of the practical value to governments of enticing anti-government sentiment. Now that I've read 1984, there could be a practical value to governments for enticing anti-government sentiment and congregating herds of protesters, of rebels. How convenient for them all to be together in a particular place. We can bring a recording device to their meeting. We can bring a bomb to their event. We can attempt to get several of them to agree to be part of some kind of a anti-government act of violence that helps to justify draconian security measures by governments. So some governments might even be so dishonest as to plant fake protesters amongst the sincere ones, and then have those fake protesters do something dramatic, like throw a grenade or throw a rock or a Molotov cocktail or whatever at armed government mercenaries, thus justifying the use of deadly force against the entire mob of protesters, even though it was just that one fake planted protester that actually did anything. Well, if there's one act of violence from the protesting mob and one member of the protesting mob towards that entire squad of riot police, well, then the riot police have justification to retaliate, to protect themselves, and all those kind of things. So there are three basic orientations that one can have in regard to governments: anti-governments, pro-governments, or neutral towards governments. I'm talking about not in regard to any specific government, but in regard to governments in general. Anti-governments, pro-governments, or neutral towards governments. You could say it this way: anti-governing, pro-governing, or neutral toward governing. I'm going to return to that in a separate part 3.